There comes a moment in life when a person looks at their own reflection and realizes they have been living a story that no longer feels like theirs. It does not arrive with drama or collapse. It arrives quietly, like a soft ache beneath the surface, a feeling that something essential has drifted out of alignment. You sense a divide between the life you perform and the life that feels true somewhere deeper inside you. Most people ignore that moment. They bury it under routine and distraction, hoping the feeling will disappear. But for some, the tension becomes impossible to silence. And that tension marks the real beginning of inner transformation. We tend to imagine change as a bold decision or a sudden awakening. Yet meaningful change rarely begins with action. It begins with awareness. Before anything shifts on the outside, something subtle rearranges within. You start noticing the small ways you've outgrown the patterns you once depended on. You feel the quiet friction between who you are and who you are becoming. This recognition is not comfortable, but it is honest. And honesty is the first act of courage. The moment you can no longer pretend that the familiar is enough, the path of transformation begins. Not with movement, but with the simple acknowledgement that life as it is no longer fits. This is the threshold where inner change truly starts. The first step of transformation is rarely a decision. It is a growing tension that makes the familiar harder to bear. At first, it appears quietly, a subtle discomfort that something in your life no longer aligns with who you are becoming. You begin to notice the routines that drain you, the conversations that feel hollow, the habits that no longer match your inner truth. Nothing has changed on the outside, yet the inner landscape is shifting, asking you to pay attention. Psychology describes this moment as the point where the cost of staying the same becomes heavier than the fear of change. It does not announce itself dramatically. It rises slowly, through small realizations that accumulate until they can no longer be ignored. It may feel like restlessness, fatigue, or a sense that you have been living on autopilot. Beneath all of these lies the same message: the life you know no longer fits the person you are quietly becoming. This threshold is uncomfortable because it interrupts the illusion of certainty, but it is also necessary. Without this tension, there is no reason for the mind to question its patterns or loosen its grip on the old identity. The discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is waking up. And the moment you recognize this tension for what it is, the process of transformation has already begun. When the tension of change becomes visible, the next question naturally arises. Why did we stay in patterns that no longer serve us for so long? The answer lies in the quiet architecture of identity, a structure built over years of conditioning and early experience. Long before we choose our beliefs, we absorb them. Long before we understand ourselves, we inherit stories about who we are allowed to be. Identity shapes behavior more powerfully than intention. It determines what feels familiar, what feels possible, and even what feels safe. A person who learned early that their needs were secondary may unconsciously seek environments that reinforce that belief. Someone who internalized doubt may gravitate towards situations that confirm it. These patterns do not persist because they are healthy. They persist because they are known. Neuroscience explains part of this inertia. The brain relies on established neural pathways, repeating whatever has been practiced the most. Even emotional reactions become rehearsed, forming circuits that guide our choices without our awareness. This is why people often repeat the same dynamics with different faces and different circumstances. The mind is not attached to the outcome, it is attached to the pattern. Recognizing this does not create change instantly, but it reveals an essential truth. We are not resisting change because we are weak or unwilling. We resist because changing the pattern means questioning the identity that has quietly guided us for years. And identity never shifts all at once. It begins with the courage to see the structure that has been shaping us from within. As you begin to see the patterns shaping your identity, another force becomes unmistakably present. The ego moves to protect what is familiar. In psychological terms, the ego is not an enemy, but a stabilizing mechanism. Its purpose is to maintain continuity in how you see yourself, even if that continuity limits your growth. Whenever the self begins to shift, the ego senses disruption and resists. This resistance often appears in subtle ways. You may try to introduce a new habit only to find yourself pulled back into old routines. You may attempt to view yourself with more compassion, yet slip into the same critical voice you have heard for years. These reactions are not signs that change is impossible. They are signs that the mind is trying to protect the identity it has learned to rely on. Growth feels chaotic because the familiar offers safety, while the unfamiliar demands trust. As awareness expands, the old narrative begins to lose its authority, and the ego struggles to regain control. This creates an inner tension that can feel confusing or destabilizing. Yet this tension is part of the process. The mind is reorganizing itself, and in that reorganization, the old structures loosen before new ones become steady. Understanding this dynamic helps soften the struggle. Resistance does not mean you are going backward. It means the identity you once depended on is beginning to dissolve. In that dissolution, space is created for a new and more authentic version of the self to take root. As resistance rises and old identities struggle to hold their place, another dimension of transformation quietly begins to unfold. Modern psychology and neuroscience reveal that the mind is not fixed. The patterns that feel immovable are supported by neural pathways built through repetition, and these pathways can be reshaped. This capacity, known as neuroplasticity, shows that change is not only psychological, it is biological. Each time you react in the same way, the brain strengthens the circuit that produces that reaction. Over years, these circuits become the default. This is why familiar habits feel effortless, while new ones feel strange or fragile. The brain is simply following the map it already knows. But it also means that every small moment of choosing differently begins to draw a new path. When someone pauses instead of reacting, or speaks with honesty instead of retreating, the brain initiates new connections. The early stages of this rewiring feel subtle, almost invisible, yet over time, as new choices repeat, the old circuits weaken. What once felt automatic begins to lose its force. What once felt unnatural starts to feel possible, then familiar. This is how inner change anchors itself in the body. Understanding this softens the frustration many people feel when transformation seems slow. The mind is learning a new way of being, and learning takes time. Neuroplasticity reminds us that change is not a moment of reinvention, but a gradual reorganization of the self at the deepest biological level. As the brain begins to reorganize itself, one principle becomes clear. Behavior does not lead identity. Identity leads behavior. A person cannot sustain actions that contradict the story they hold about who they are. This is why attempts at change often collapse. People try to introduce new habits without altering the internal narrative from which those habits grow. When someone sees themselves as undisciplined, attempts to build structure feel temporary. When they believe they are unworthy, efforts towards self-care feel unnatural. The mind always gravitates toward the identity it finds most familiar. Even choices that seem self-defeating often arise from the desire to remain consistent with that inner story. Transformation begins when this narrative softens. A person does not have to declare a new identity with certainty. They only need to allow space for a different way of seeing themselves. Simple internal shifts such as I am learning or I am becoming create enough room for new behavior to take root. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate, and the identity that once felt distant becomes the one that feels true. Once identity shifts, behavior no longer requires force. It aligns naturally with the person you are growing into. This is why the deepest changes feel effortless once they stabilize. The outer world begins to reflect the inner truth that has quietly taken shape. Identity changes first, action follows. This is the quiet architecture behind every lasting transformation. As identity begins to shift, a person enters a phase that feels both unsettling and quietly profound. It is the space between who they have been and who they are becoming. In this in-between state, the old patterns no longer feel natural, yet the new ones have not fully formed. The result is a sense of uncertainty that can feel disorienting, as though the ground once familiar has started to dissolve. This stage is often misunderstood. People believe that confusion signals failure, when in reality it signals transition. The mind is shedding the structures it once relied on, and those structures must loosen before new ones can take their place. This loosening creates emotional turbulence. Doubt intensifies. Old habits return briefly. The clarity that felt strong one day may disappear the next. These shifts are not signs of regression, but reflections of an inner world reorganizing itself. The liminal space is where automatic living is interrupted. Without the old identity guiding every reaction, a person becomes more aware of their inner landscape. Thoughts, emotions, and impulses that once went unnoticed begin to stand out clearly. This heightened awareness is uncomfortable, but it is also transformative. It allows a person to meet themselves honestly, rather than through the lens of familiar narratives. This in-between stage is not a detour. It is the crucible in which the new self is shaped. In the uncertainty, something essential is being refined, preparing the mind and heart for what comes next. As a person moves through the uncertain space of transformation, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Meaningful change cannot unfold if the emotional world remains hidden. Many people try to reshape their lives without allowing themselves to feel the emotions that have shaped them for years. They suppress discomfort, avoid vulnerability, and quickly turn away from anything that stirs fear or sadness. Yet the emotions they push aside continue to guide their choices quietly from within. Emotions act as signals that reveal what is unresolved. Fear may point toward the parts of life where past experiences still influence the present. Anger may indicate boundaries that were never honored. Sadness may reflect unmet needs or losses that were never acknowledged. When these emotions are ignored, the patterns connected to them remain intact, making change feel impossible, no matter how much effort is applied. Research in psychology shows that when emotions are met with awareness rather than resistance, the brain begins to process them differently. The reactive centers calm, and the areas responsible for reflection and clarity become more active. This shift allows emotions to move instead of becoming embedded in familiar patterns. Emotional awareness is not about dwelling on every feeling. It is about allowing each emotion enough space to be understood. When a person meets their inner experience with honesty, they reclaim parts of themselves that were once suppressed. In that reclaiming, transformation begins to deepen. Awareness becomes not only a tool but a doorway through which the self slowly reorganizes and heals. As emotional awareness deepens, another influence on transformation becomes impossible to overlook. Inner change does not unfold in isolation. It interacts constantly with the environment that surrounds a person. Even the most sincere efforts to grow can be weakened when the external world continually reflects the identity a person is trying to outgrow. Environment includes far more than physical space. It is the atmosphere created by daily routines, by the tone of conversations, by the expectations others hold, and by the subtle cues that reinforce familiar behaviors. These elements form a psychological climate that either supports transformation or anchors a person to what they have always known. When the environment affirms old patterns, the mind returns to them with ease. When it opens space for new choices, change becomes more natural and less forced. Recognizing this does not mean relying on the environment for transformation. It means understanding that inner work stabilizes more quickly when outer conditions no longer contradict it. A supportive environment does not push change forward. It simply does not hold it back. It allows the emerging identity to be practiced, expressed, and eventually rooted. Transformation begins within, but it is strengthened by the context in which a person lives. When the inner world and the environment move in harmony, the path forward becomes clearer and the new self has room to grow. As the inner and outer landscapes begin to align, a quiet realization emerges. Transformation does not always feel like becoming someone new. Often, it feels like uncovering someone who has been there all along, hidden beneath years of adaptation and self-protection. This is the paradox of becoming. Growth appears to move a person forward, yet it also draws them back to a truth that existed before fear shaped their choices and before habit shaped their identity. Throughout life, people learn to wear certain roles, They adjust their behavior to feel accepted, to avoid conflict, or to meet expectations that once felt necessary. Over time, these roles begin to feel like the self, even though they were only strategies for navigating the world. When transformation unfolds, these strategies loosen. A deeper presence comes forward, not as a sudden arrival but as a gradual revealing. This process is gentle. A person notices they no longer react with the same urgency, or no longer cling to the same stories about who they must be. They choose honesty more easily and find themselves drawn toward what feels authentic, rather than what feels familiar. These small shifts are not additions to the self but returns to it. The paradox of becoming reminds us that transformation is not about creating a new identity from nothing. It is about clearing the inner space so the most genuine parts of the self can finally breathe. In that return, change becomes both profound and deeply natural. As the deeper self begins to surface, a broader understanding of growth becomes clear. Transformation is not a single ascent toward a final version of oneself. It unfolds in cycles. The same lessons return at different stages of life, each time inviting a deeper response and offering a wider perspective. What once triggered fear begins to elicit reflection. What once felt overwhelming becomes something a person can meet with steadiness. This gradual refinement is the true rhythm of psychological development. Progress in this stage rarely appears dramatic. It is found in small, consistent shifts. A moment of patience where there once was reactivity. A moment of clarity where confusion once dominated. A choice rooted in truth rather than habit. These subtle movements, repeated over time, indicate that the inner world has grown more coherent. They show that awareness, identity, and emotional understanding are becoming integrated rather than competing for control. Life will continue to present uncertainty, challenge, and change, but the person meeting these experiences is no longer the same. Their sense of meaning expands, their resilience strengthens, their relationship with themselves becomes anchored rather than fragile. This is the nature of the spiral. It brings us back to familiar themes, but at every return we meet them with more wisdom than before. Transformation has no final destination because the self is not a fixed endpoint. It is a living process, unfolding, deepening, and becoming more whole with every cycle of awareness. As the cycles of growth continue, one truth stands at the center of every transformation. Change begins not with force or ambition, but with awareness. Awareness is the quiet shift that reveals what has been guiding our lives from the shadows. It softens resistance, clarifies patterns, and opens the space where new choices can finally take root. It is gentle, but its influence is profound. When a person learns to stay present with themselves, the nature of change becomes different. It no longer feels like a struggle to become someone else. It becomes an unfolding, a gradual alignment between the inner world and the life being lived. Old habits lose their authority because they are seen clearly. Old fears loosen because they are understood. The narratives that once shaped identity begin to fall away, making room for what feels grounded and true. In time, transformation becomes less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about steady presence. It shows itself in clarity, in honesty, in the calm strength of someone who knows themselves without needing to perform. The shift may be quiet, yet it marks a profound evolution of the self. To transform is not to chase a different identity. It is to awaken to the depth already within you. Awareness is the doorway. Once it opens, the journey of becoming unfolds naturally, one conscious moment at a time.